Welcome everyone to this flagship seminar, part of the bank's wider engagement program. We've got a fantastic audience, 250 and counting it when I last looked, which just shows how much interest there is in this particular topic and this particular speaker, despite the competing interests of getting a haircut and going to the pub. So let me welcome our very special guest, David Hamilton. Could you say, that's really fascinating, on the, because I think people would probably get some of the link from kindness to feeling good, the sort of the neurological, but the biological bit, the kind of physical health thing, is a bit of a wow. Could you elaborate a bit on, well, maybe on both bits, but particularly on how it affects our biologies as well as our neurologies, David?
Yeah, well, the principal way it works is that, kindness is, physiologically speaking, the opposite of stress. And I say, when I say the opposite of stress, stress, we can be in a, stress is a feeling, and it's not really to do with the situation that you're in. It's to do with how you feel about the situation you're in, because two people can be in exact same situation. One feels stressed, the other doesn't. Now, when you feel stressed, the feeling produces what most people are familiar with: stress hormones. We call, things like adrenaline, cortisol. I think many people are familiar with those. Scientists call them stress hormones. Now, when you be kind, because of how that feels, it's the feeling that it generates from helping someone. You produce not stress hormones, you produce kindness hormones. I call them kindness hormones, really to draw that parallel with stress, that they're produced because of how it feels. And if you had to chart through in the body all the physical effects of stress, you find that the physical effects of kindness hormones are opposite in direction. They're sometimes equal in strength, but they go opposite in direction. So, for example, stress hormones are known to increase blood pressure, but kindness hormones can do the exact opposite, and they can actually reduce blood pressure. Stress hormones can make us age faster. Kindness hormones can slow down that kind of process. So in many ways, to make it really simple, it's really just physiologically the opposite of what happens when you feel stressed.
And how do we think? I think this is really, really fascinating. Actually, this is this is the ultimate de-stress device. How do we think about kindness? And I might come back to you for a definition of kindness as well, actually, just so we all know exactly what you're talking about, David, on that. How would something like kindness then relate to something that might be familiar to many people on the call, mindfulness or meditation, things that sort of calm them? How do we think about the differences or the similarities between those two things?
Right, very, very similar. Actually, see, many people are familiar with mindfulness, and for those listeners who are not very familiar, think of it like this way: if you breathe, which I'm hoping you're doing right now, but let's say you were to breathe and then notice that you're breathing. So in noticing that you're breathing, you're becoming mindful of the fact that you're breathing. So in a nutshell, that's mindfulness. It's literally just being mindful of the fact that you're breathing. And funnily enough, if you were to look at the brain, what happens when you've been mindful like that is you actually take a portion of the brain to the gym. So if I went to the gym and worked out my bicep, then you would notice two things happening. First, the muscle would become firmer, and then the muscle would become larger. So if you work out a region of the brain, the exact same thing happens. Although neuroscientists don't call it muscle growth, they've got a really fancy name. It's called neuroplasticity, but it means the same. If ever you hear the term neuroplasticity, it's really just the brain's version of muscle growth. And so what happens when you breathe and then notice that that's what you're doing, you give it your mindful attention to it, you work out this portion of the brain and it becomes firmer and it becomes stronger. So there's a real physical change in the brain. But let's say instead of doing mindfulness, you do kindfulness. And kindfulness is really just when you notice that you're breathing, but then you take some of your attention off of the fact that you're breathing and you move your attention now onto thinking kind thoughts about people, onto just thinking reasons why you value people in your life, reasons why that you might be really grateful that a person contributed to your life, or something that they did, or you even might think of someone in your life who's suffering right now and really wish that things go well for them. But what's happening is you're generating a feeling. Now, if you were to scan the brain, it turns out that you're working this whole part of the brain here at the front, but with an ever so slight bias to the left hand side and further in towards the middle. And what's happening is kindfulness, i.e., thinking kindness and feeling the feelings, is causing a physical change to the actual structure of the brain. And this actually partly explains why being kind, in many, many scientific studies, consistent kindness is associated with improvements in happiness. And it's also protective in the long term towards depression. Doesn't mean that if you be kind, you're never going to be unhappy and you're never going to be depressed. It doesn't mean that at all. But there's a degree of protective effect there. There's a kind of inner resilience that's caused by the actual physical change in the brain. Just like if I worked out a muscle and then I had to lift something, or if something dropped, I might be able to support the weight a little bit better because I've built that muscle. So if you build this muscle, you can support the weight of life that little bit better, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. It's a very nice metaphor and a very nice way of putting it, David. And just on the, you mentioned